On Father's Day, my son gave a $45,000 car to his father-in-law, and gave me $20 slippers and a note. A week later, he called me 23 times, "Dad, don't do this." It was already too late to regret it. John Hargrove sat alone on the edge of his porch swing, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across the quiet yard. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky in soft pink and gold, while a warm summer breeze rustled the leaves of the maple tree he had planted nearly 30 years earlier, the same year his son Michael was born. It was Father's Day, a date he had never demanded recognition for, but one he secretly hoped would carry a little meaning. He looked down at the gift resting in his lap, a pair of navy blue flip-flops still in their plastic packaging, the kind sold at gas stations or discount stores. Tucked under the straps was a folded piece of paper with Michael's unmistakable handwriting. John hesitated, then unfolded the note slowly, his hands more weathered now than he remembered. "Thanks for everything, Dad. Hope you're enjoying retirement. Michael." That was it. No "love you," no memory recalled, no joke between father and son. Just 13 words, flat, distant, functional. John let the paper fall into his lap, where it rested beside the flip-flops. He breathed in slowly, then exhaled through his nose, holding the silence like a fragile object in his chest. He wasn't an ungrateful man. Never had been. He didn't measure love in money or in the value of gifts. But something in the simplicity, no, the effortlessness, of the gesture unsettled him. He tried to brush it off. Maybe Michael had been busy. Maybe he didn't want to make a fuss. Maybe this was his way of saying he cared. The phone buzzed on the small patio table beside him. A message popped up in the family group chat. His daughter-in-law, Emily, had just posted a picture. There it was. Clear as daylight. Her father, Peter Monroe, was standing in front of a gleaming black Lexus SUV with a massive red bow on the hood. The caption read, "Happy Father's Day, Dad. You deserve the world. Michael and I love you so much." John stared at the screen, the brightness of the image sharp against the fading evening light. He blinked twice, then zoomed in. The dealership sign in the background confirmed it. Not rented. Not borrowed. A brand new luxury vehicle. A car that likely cost over $45,000. He didn't move. Didn't speak. Didn't react. The message thread filled with heart emojis and congratulatory comments from cousins and friends. Emily replied to someone, saying Peter had always dreamed of owning a Lexus, and Michael wanted to surprise him. John's hand trembled slightly as he set the phone down. He looked again at the flip-flops. It wasn't about the money. God, no. John had never cared about wealth or gifts. He had built a life from hard work and long hours, years spent working as a lineman, scaling utility poles in storms and snow, coming home only to fix dinner when his wife was sick, to help Michael with homework, to fall asleep on the couch with aching joints. He had given everything to his family, quietly and without expectation. Still, something broke inside him as he sat there. It wasn't just a pair of cheap sandals. It was a message. A message that said, "You don't matter as much. Not anymore. Maybe not ever." He got up slowly, his knees stiff, and walked inside. The living room was quiet. The framed pictures on the mantel showed a life well lived, vacations from long ago, Little League trophies, a Christmas morning where Michael sat grinning with a new bicycle that John had assembled in the garage the night before. He poured himself a glass of water, but left it untouched on the kitchen counter. Later that night, the house was silent except for the faint hum of the fridge and the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards. John sat in the dark at the edge of his bed, still holding the folded note. He stared at it for a long time, then tucked it into the drawer of his nightstand, beneath a stack of old letters from his wife, long past. He laid back on the bed and stared at the ceiling fan spinning slowly overhead. He didn't feel angry. Not yet. Just hollow. And that feeling would settle in quietly, like dust in an empty room, refusing to be ignored. John didn't bring it up, not the car, not the photo, not even the sandals. For the next few days, he let the hours move around him like fog, silent and slow. He watered the plants, fed the neighbor's dog while they were away, and watched the local news with the volume barely audible. He even smiled at the cashier at the grocery store when she asked how his father's day had gone. "Nice," he said. "Quiet." He didn't mention the note. Or the flip-flops. Or the Lexus. The following Saturday, Michael invited him over for lunch. It was a last-minute thing, and that alone was unusual. John hesitated before accepting, then told himself he was being ridiculous. Maybe the gift was just a misunderstanding. Maybe Michael had something else planned. Maybe it wasn't over yet. He arrived at the suburban house just before noon. The neighborhood was neatly trimmed, with identical mailboxes and slow-rolling SUVs. Emily greeted him at the door with a cheerful hug, calling him Dad, as she always did. Inside, the air smelled like grilled chicken and lemon pie. Their twin daughters, Olivia and Claire, raced through the hallway with bare feet and sticky fingers. John smiled, ruffling their hair as they ran past. Lunch was served at the back patio under a canvas canopy. The sun was warm, the lemonade tart and sweet. Peter Monroe, the man from the Lexus photo, sat at the far end of the table, laughing with a bourbon in hand. He wore a crisp polo shirt and a new watch that glinted in the sun. He looked like a man who had everything he'd ever wanted. John sat across from Michael, who looked relaxed, a little tired maybe, but content. The food was good, the breeze gentle, and for a while, the moment almost felt normal. Then Emily started talking. She was telling a story about the dealership. How surprised her father had been. How the manager had come out with balloons. How the entire showroom had clapped. "You should have seen his face," she said, laughing. "He looked like a kid at Christmas." Michael chimed in. "We had to coordinate the financing and delivery without him finding out. Took weeks. But it was worth it. He's always been there for us, and, well, he deserved something big this year." John didn't speak. He took a bite of chicken and chewed slowly, staring at the tablecloth's floral pattern. Something cold pressed against his chest, but he held his expression still. Not a flicker. Not a wince. Peter leaned back in his chair. "It was the nicest surprise I've ever had," he said, raising his glass. "I mean, I knew you two were generous, but that blew me away." Emily beamed. Michael looked proud. John reached for his water, took a sip, and nodded as if agreeing with a statement no one had made directly to him. The conversation drifted. Talk of the girls' dance recital, a summer trip to San Diego, a minor issue with the home's HVAC system. Through it all, John contributed where he could, small comments, polite laughter, the occasional nod. But his mind had begun to drift. Not to the gift itself, or the money, but to the obvious fact, this family operated on a system he no longer fully belonged to. Later, when dessert was served, Olivia climbed into his lap with a piece of lemon pie. "Grandpa, can I tell you a secret?" John smiled. "Of course, sweetheart. We're going to the beach next weekend, but don't tell Mommy I told you, okay?" "I won't," he whispered, brushing her hair back. "Your secret's safe." Emily looked over. "She's terrible at keeping surprises," she said fondly. Michael chuckled, then added, "But at least she's honest." That stung. For some reason, that one sentence pierced deeper than the rest. At least she's honest. As if honesty was a given. As if everyone at the table had always been exactly that. As the afternoon wound down, John helped clear some of the dishes inside. The kitchen was spotless, all stainless steel and granite countertops. He stood there alone for a moment, staring at the refrigerator door where photos and magnets hung in uneven rows. There was one of Michael and Peter at a baseball game. One from Christmas, all of them in matching sweaters. Another of the girls in front of the new car, Peter holding the keys with a big grin. No photo of John anywhere. He didn't make a sound. Just picked up a dish towel, dried a glass, and placed it carefully on the rack. Michael entered a moment later. "Hey, Dad. Thanks for coming. It was good to have you." John turned, smiled faintly. "Of course. Always good to see the girls." Michael gave him a quick hug. "We should do this more often." "Sure," John said. But as he stepped outside into the afternoon light, walking back to his old pickup parked 2 blocks down, because the driveway and the street out front were full of guests, he felt a strange stillness descend over him. It wasn't rage. Not bitterness either. It was something deeper, older, like a crack in the foundation of something he had believed was solid. He had done everything right. He had shown up, worked hard, stayed honest. And somewhere along the way, that had stopped being enough. He sat behind the wheel of his truck for a long time before turning the key. At home, the silence returned, louder than before. He poured himself a glass of scotch, the good kind he saved for rare occasions, and sat on the porch as the sky dimmed. The note still sat in the drawer beside his bed, untouched. The flip-flops were in the same plastic bag, now resting by the door like an accusation. The truth was finally clear, not because someone had said it, but because no one had needed to. They had all moved on. Without him. And he wasn't sure yet what he was going to do about it. But he knew this, he wouldn't stay silent much longer. The day after the lunch, John didn't get out of bed until well past 10. That was unlike him. Even in retirement, he maintained a quiet discipline, morning walks, reading the paper, tending to the garden. But that morning, he lay under the thin quilt, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of a house that had grown too still over the years. He finally got up, made coffee without eating anything, and sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around the mug, elbows resting on old stains in the wood, marks left by a science project Michael had once worked on in the 7th grade. John stared at that faded circle for a long while. And then, without quite knowing why, he stood up, walked to the hall closet, and pulled out a dusty cardboard box labeled "M's School Stuff." He carried it to the living room and placed it gently on the floor beside the couch. The tape peeled back like old skin, and the scent of paper and time wafted out. Inside were fragments of another life, construction paper cards with clumsy crayon drawings, spelling tests with gold stars, faded photographs of father-son fishing trips, and a 4th-grade essay titled, "My Hero is My Dad." John held that single sheet for several minutes. The handwriting was big and uneven. He could almost hear the voice of 10-year-old Michael as he read it aloud again in his mind, something he had not done in decades. "My hero is my dad because he never gives up. He works even when he is tired. He helps me with homework. He always comes to my games, even when it rains. One day I want to be just like him." John set the paper down carefully, his fingers trembling. That memory hit harder than expected, not because it was sweet, but because of how completely that child seemed to have vanished. He sifted through more items, a middle school report card, a photo of Michael in a Halloween costume John had sewn together in a panic the night before the party, a video cassette labeled "Graduation 2006. He didn't have a VCR anymore. The house, like his life, had moved on in parts while others had stayed frozen in time. That afternoon, he drove into town. Not for groceries. Not for errands. He just drove. Past the school Michael had attended. Past the old baseball fields where he had once sat in a folding chair every Saturday, yelling encouragement, keeping score on a clipboard. Past the movie theater they used to visit on weekends, sneaking in snacks, laughing in the truck afterward. Everything was still there. Except Michael. John parked near the diner where they used to get burgers after games. He didn't go in. He just sat in the cab, the engine off, the windows down, letting the warm wind move across his face as a dull ache pressed into his ribs. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to admit it, he missed his son. Not the man Michael had become, successful, confident, busy, but the boy he had once carried on his shoulders, the kid who used to crawl into bed on stormy nights, the teenager who called him Pop when no one was listening. That version of Michael seemed so far away now that John wasn't sure it had ever really existed. Maybe it had all been a version he wanted to see. The real wound came not from being left out of a gift or forgotten on a holiday, but from the growing suspicion that somewhere along the road, Michael had stopped seeing him as essential. He had become background, a fixture, not a foundation. Back at home, John wandered into the garage. The workbench was covered in dust, the tools arranged as he had always kept them, neatly, by type and size. In the corner was a faded wooden box labeled Camp Gear. He knelt down and opened it. Inside were remnants of the trips he and Michael used to take into the mountains, old lanterns, a folding stove, a dented aluminum kettle, the flint striker they'd used to start a fire during a rainstorm in Utah. He found the pocketknife he had given Michael when he turned 12. It still had his initials carved into the side. John stared at it, then slowly closed his hand around it. That night, he sat on the back porch again, whiskey in hand, and watched the stars. The night was quiet except for the distant sound of crickets and the low hum of a passing train. His phone sat beside him, silent and still. He didn't expect a call. He hadn't received one since the lunch. He reached for a pad of paper and a pen from the drawer near the kitchen and began to write. Not a letter. Not exactly. More like a memory dump. He filled several pages with moments, thoughts, reflections, some of them bitter, some full of longing. He wasn't trying to make a point. He just needed it out of him. The page began. You used to run down the driveway and leap into my arms like the world was too small for your joy. I used to think those days would never end. But they did. And maybe I didn't notice when they did. Maybe I let you grow up without preparing myself for the silence you'd leave behind. He stopped after that. Folded the paper and placed it on the table. The following morning, he drove to the cemetery. Not for any holiday. Not even for the anniversary. Just to talk. His wife's grave was clean and well kept. He knelt beside it, brushing away a few leaves, and placed a single white flower beside the headstone. Then he sat back on his heels and spoke out loud. I think I'm losing him, he said quietly. I think I already have. He looked at the horizon, the sky pale and cloudless. You'd know what to say. You'd remind me to be patient. But I've been patient. I've waited long enough. He ran a hand over his face, exhausted from memories. You always said he loved me. But I'm not sure he sees me anymore. The wind rustled the grass, and for a moment, it felt like she was still there, just behind him, listening as she always had. He left the cemetery without crying. He was too tired to cry. Back at home, he pulled out a file folder from the cabinet beside the bookshelf. Inside were his estate papers, a draft will, insurance documents, bank statements. He spread them out on the dining table, glanced through the names, the allocations. He saw Michael's name more than once. He stared at it for a long time. Then, very quietly, he removed it. It wasn't out of revenge. It wasn't meant to hurt. It was simply an act of recognition. A man had to be seen. And if he wasn't seen by his own son anymore, then maybe it was time to shift his weight toward what still held meaning. Not away from love, but toward dignity. The next few nights passed without rest. John's sleep had become shallow, broken by a kind of invisible weight pressing on his chest, less a physical sensation and more like a question that wouldn't leave him alone. Each morning he woke up groggier, less anchored, his mind still echoing the same 4 words. This is not nothing. He wasn't sure when it had stopped being about the gift or even the growing distance. The silence had grown roots. Now, something deeper had begun to stir, like a current shifting far beneath the surface. The kind of shift that precedes a storm. One night, just before 3 o'clock in the morning, he sat up in bed, suddenly and without cause, as if summoned by something inside himself. He slipped on his slippers, pulled a sweater over his shoulders, and stepped into the hallway. The house was as still as ever. Outside, the night air was cool, almost sharp, a reminder that summer was slowly giving way to fall. He moved toward the study, a room he rarely used anymore. It had once been the place where he paid bills, wrote Christmas cards, kept records. Over time, it had become a storage space for forgotten things. But that night, he sat at the desk with an eerie clarity, pulled a clean sheet of paper toward him, and began to write. The letter started simply. To whom it may concern. But it wasn't an ordinary letter. It was a formal request for the revision of his living will. Not out of spite, and certainly not with a heavy hand. Every line was measured, precise. His lawyer, David Patel, had always told him to keep things up to date. This would be that update. When he finished, he signed his name, tucked the letter into an envelope, and sealed it with quiet purpose. He would call David in the morning. Back in the kitchen, he brewed coffee. Not because he needed the caffeine, but because the act of doing something familiar helped anchor the surreal clarity of what he had just done. By the time the sun rose, he was already dressed and waiting in his truck outside Patel's office. David Patel was a man in his early 50s, efficient, respectful, and never in a hurry. He had handled John's affairs for nearly 2 decades and had known both Michael and Emily socially through charity events. When John handed him the envelope, David opened it, read silently, then looked up. "You're sure about this?" he asked. "I'm not doing this in anger," John said. "I just think it's time to make things clear." David nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "Do you want to explain anything to them? Sometimes families appreciate a little context." "No," John replied. "If I explain it, it turns into a negotiation. This isn't that." David didn't push. He never did. "Then I'll draft the updates and have them ready for you to sign by Thursday." "Thank you." On the way back home, John took a detour down Route 94, a road he hadn't driven in years. It led past an old used RV lot just outside the edge of town, White Pines Motors and Leisure. He didn't plan to stop. At least, he told himself that. But his hands turned the wheel without asking his mind. The lot was half full. A few modest trailers lined the rows, some vintage, others gleaming and oversized with digital displays. John stepped out of the truck, squinting under the midday sun, and was quickly greeted by a woman in a blue flannel shirt and jeans. "Looking for something to travel in or something to live in?" she asked, friendly but direct. "Something in between," John replied. Her name was Kayla. She walked him through a few models, nothing too large, nothing flashy. After an hour of casual browsing and light conversation, he stopped in front of a 24-foot Class C motorhome. It was compact but well kept. Enough space for one person. No luxury, but no sacrifice either. He didn't ask the price right away. He stepped inside and stood at the small kitchenette, ran his hand across the laminated counter, opened one of the cabinets. There was a small fold-out table by the window, a modest bed tucked in the rear corner, and enough storage for someone with no one left to impress. It felt right. He asked about the price. It was within reach, especially now that he had sold the undeveloped property he once intended to leave for Michael. That sale had closed quietly the week before. The funds had gone into a separate account. He told Kayla he'd think about it, but deep down, he already knew. That night, he sat again at his kitchen table and unfolded a new sheet of paper. This one was not for the lawyer. It was addressed to Michael. Not to be sent. Not yet. Just something he needed to get out. "Michael. There's a kind of silence that grows louder with time. I've been listening to it for years. I don't know if you've noticed, but the man who raised you, he hasn't gone anywhere. He's just been standing in the same place while you built a life I was never invited into. This isn't a complaint. It's not even disappointment anymore. It's just a realization. If I don't speak now, I might never speak again. And I refuse to leave this life having swallowed everything I should have said." He stopped there. Folded the page. No envelope this time. Instead, he tucked it into the small fireproof lockbox where he kept his passport and military discharge papers. The next morning, he signed the revised will. By the end of the week, the motorhome was his. He told no one. Not even his sister, who called once a month to check in. Not the neighbors. Not the pastor from the local church. Not even the old friends he still met for coffee on occasion. John began quietly selling off things he no longer needed. Old tools, winter coats, even the second television in the guest room. He made appointments to cancel utilities and spoke to the post office about forwarding his mail. Each task gave him a strange kind of peace. A sense that he was reclaiming something that had slowly slipped away, agency. He hadn't made a scene. Hadn't raised his voice. Hadn't sent angry messages or crafted bitter replies. He had just made a decision. Quiet. Measured. Final. And when the morning came for him to leave, there were no goodbyes. Just a note left on the kitchen counter. Gone traveling. Don't worry. I'm not lost. Just moving again. He locked the door behind him, stepped into the motorhome, and turned the ignition. The road opened up in front of him, long, quiet, and unfamiliar. Exactly what he needed. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Michael received the voicemail. He had just wrapped up a conference call and was about to step into another when he saw the missed call alert from a local number he didn't recognize. The voicemail transcription appeared on his screen. "This is David Patel, your father's attorney. Nothing urgent, just need a moment of your time regarding some updates Mr. Hargrove has initiated." Michael hesitated. David Patel. His father's lawyer. The message wasn't alarming on the surface. But it was unusual. His dad hadn't mentioned anything about making changes. In fact, he hadn't mentioned much of anything lately. Their last real conversation had been at the Father's Day lunch, and even then, it had been surface level. Michael had noticed something different about his dad that day, quieter than usual, distant in a way that felt intentional. But he'd chalked it up to age, or mood, or maybe a simple case of generational difference. Now, this message brought a new kind of static into the air. He called back during his lunch break. David's assistant picked up, transferred the call promptly, and within moments, Michael was on the line with the man who had handled his father's affairs for as long as he could remember. "Michael, thanks for returning the call," David said with the careful tone of someone who dealt daily in delicate matters. "Your father asked me to pass along a document, just an updated version of his estate planning. He requested full transparency and asked that you receive a copy, as he's done with previous versions." Michael frowned. "Updated? When did he do this?" "Last week. He signed the revised version on Thursday." It was a straightforward revision, but he wanted no ambiguity about his wishes. "Did something happen?" Michael asked. "I can't speak to his motivations," David replied. "Only that he was calm, clear, and deliberate." There was a pause. Michael felt a tightness building in his chest. "I'll have the document delivered to your home or office, whichever you prefer," David continued. "Office," Michael said quickly. "Please." "Understood." They ended the call politely, but Michael remained at his desk, staring out the window of his office as if something outside might explain what was unfolding inside. The document arrived 2 days later in a sealed envelope. Michael didn't open it right away. He left it on the corner of his desk, staring at it between meetings, during phone calls, even while eating lunch. Finally, late that evening after the office had cleared out, he shut his laptop and opened the envelope. The new will was concise. Familiar format. Standard phrasing. But the distribution section was drastically different. Michael's name was almost absent. The trust that had once been set aside for his family's security had been rerouted to various charities, an education fund for underprivileged students, and a portion to a preservation foundation that John had always admired. The property his father lived in? Now designated to be donated to a veterans housing program upon his death. A note at the bottom simply read, "This is not a punishment. This is alignment." Michael sat back in his chair. The air in the room suddenly felt too dense. He reread the pages 3 times, hoping to find something, some line that softened the blow, explained the change, left room for misunderstanding. But there was nothing of the sort. For the first time, he felt something he couldn't easily categorize. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't confusion. It was fear. Fear that something had shifted beyond repair. That night, after putting the girls to bed, Michael sat outside on the patio with his laptop closed, the will still resting in his leather briefcase inside. Emily noticed his silence and leaned against the doorframe, watching him. "Everything okay?" she asked. He hesitated. "My dad changed his will." "Oh," she replied carefully. "He left almost nothing to us," Michael said, still staring into the backyard. "No property, no trust, not even the lake cabin." Emily came closer. "Did he explain why?" "Not really. There's a note. Says it's not a punishment, just alignment." She stayed silent for a moment, then sat beside him. "He's been quiet for a while. I thought maybe it was just age. Or, maybe he's just pulling back." Michael nodded, but the words didn't feel enough. "I think I missed something," he said finally. "Something big." Emily put her hand on his, gently. "Maybe you should call him. Or go see him." He nodded again but didn't move. The next morning, he tried calling. The call went straight to voicemail. He tried again in the afternoon. Same result. That night, he called a third time, still no answer. By the weekend, he had tried 5 times with no reply. Then, on Sunday morning, he drove to his father's house. The porch was swept clean. The curtains were drawn. The mailbox was empty. There was no sign of anything wrong, no damage, no notices, no hint of panic. But there was no sign of his father either. He rang the bell twice. Knocked. Waited. Finally, he pulled out his phone and called again, standing right there on the porch. Inside, no phone rang. That was when he noticed the small slip of paper taped to the inside of the door's window, barely visible behind the lace curtain. "Gone traveling. Don't worry. I'm not lost. Just moving again. No date. No return plan." Just those words, sitting on the edge of ambiguity. Michael stepped back, reading them again. He didn't know where John had gone, or how long he planned to be away, or what exactly had pushed him over the edge. But now he knew, something had broken. And this note, this disappearance, this sudden reordering of the future, it wasn't a tantrum. It was a message. A quiet, deliberate message. And it was only the first sign. John didn't track the days in the way he used to. Time felt different on the road. Morning came with the sound of birds he didn't recognize and the glint of sunrise on the dashboard of the motorhome. Evening settled with the distant hum of nature or, depending on the campground, the low murmur of other travelers exchanging stories by flickering lanterns. He had started in Missouri, winding westward through Kansas with no particular destination. He'd stop at rest areas, small towns, and scenic overlooks, making decisions on a whim. He avoided the interstates. He preferred back roads, routes where people waved as they passed, where coffee shops served eggs with burnt edges and hash browns that tasted like memory. Inside the motorhome, his world was small but sufficient. A stovetop kettle. A notebook with handwritten observations. A stack of postcards he never mailed. He didn't listen to the radio. The silence was his companion now, less empty, more alive. But despite the peace, a consequence had begun to ripple outward, one he had both anticipated and tried not to imagine. Michael was unraveling. It began with minor disruptions. Missed meetings. Distraction during conference calls. Emily noticed first. Then her father. Then the girls, who asked why Daddy was suddenly so quiet at dinner. Michael brushed it off as stress. Work, obligations, the end of summer chaos. But inside, he was flailing. He checked his phone constantly. Every hour. Sometimes every 10 minutes. The silence from his father wasn't just inconvenient, it was haunting. He reread the will multiple times, trying to decode something beneath the surface. He looked again at the note on the door, "Gone traveling. Don't worry. I'm not lost. Just moving again. He obsessed over the wording. The vagueness. The intent. And then the dream started. He began waking up in the middle of the night, heart racing, drenched in sweat, sometimes unsure of where he was. In the dreams, he was often a child, searching for someone, his father, but never able to reach him. Always too far. Always just out of sight. One night, after lying awake until nearly dawn, he walked into the kitchen and stood in front of the refrigerator, staring at the family photos pinned there. There were plenty with Emily. The girls. Peter, of course. But only 2 with John. One from Michael's college graduation, where John stood stiff in a suit too big for him. And another from Olivia's first birthday, where John sat at the edge of the frame, almost an afterthought, holding a plastic plate of cake. Michael removed the graduation photo and held it in his hand for a long time. By the end of that week, he began calling his father's old friends. People from church. Retired neighbors. A few contacts in John's phone he recognized but hadn't spoken to in years. None of them knew where he was. But one name kept coming up, Ralph. An old fishing buddy. Michael drove across town and knocked on Ralph's door early one Saturday. Ralph answered in a worn flannel robe, blinking against the morning light. "Michael," he said, a little surprised. "Been years. You all right? Have you heard from my dad?" Ralph stepped aside. "Come in." Inside, the house was cluttered with fishing rods and newspaper stacks. A sports game played softly on the television in the background. "He stopped by 3 weeks ago," Ralph said as they Saturday, didn't say much. "Gave me a bottle of scotch and a copy of that old photo we took at Lake Tenecamo back in the day. Said he was going to disappear a little while." Michael swallowed hard. "Did he say where?" Ralph shook his head. "Just said he needed space. Said it wasn't about anyone else. That it was time he lived for himself, not just the memory of who people thought he was." Michael sat in silence, the weight of those words heavy. "I don't think he was angry," Ralph added. "He was calm. Sad, maybe. But clear. That was almost worse." Back home, Michael stood at the window of his office, looking out but seeing nothing. A sudden image flashed through his mind, his father building a treehouse when Michael was 9. It had taken 3 weekends, a dozen trips to the hardware store, and one splintered ladder accident. But John had finished it. Alone. Just to see his son smile. Michael sat down and opened his laptop. He began typing, not work emails or reports, but a list. Memories. Little things. He remembered the camping trips. The night he cried over a lost dog and John sat with him in the yard for hours. The time John skipped work to attend his school play, even though he only had one line. He wrote until tears blurred the screen. Then, for the first time in days, he did something different. He recorded a video message. Not a call. Not a voicemail. A message. The camera showed his face, tired and bare. "Dad," he began, voice hoarse. "I don't know where you are. I'm not calling to ask you to come home. I'm not going to talk about the will, or the gift, or any of the things I didn't see before. I miss you. And I'm starting to see the things I didn't let myself see before. Not just lately, but for years." He paused, eyes lowering. "I think I started treating you like you were just always going to be there. Like a given. Like furniture. But you weren't. You are, the foundation. I just didn't look down long enough to notice." He pressed send before he could think twice, unsure if the message would be received, or if it would be ignored. And somewhere, miles away, John sat parked at a cliffside rest area in Arizona, watching the sunset wash the desert in fire. He heard the soft ping of a message notification. He didn't open it yet. Not out of anger. But because sometimes, silence was the only space where truth could breathe. And now, that space was shifting. The call came 2 days after Michael sent the video. It was early, just past 6 o'clock in the morning. The house was still quiet, the sun barely stretching across the kitchen counters. Michael had been awake for nearly an hour, unable to sleep again, drinking cold coffee and rereading the message he had sent to his father. He didn't expect a response, at least not so soon. Part of him believed the video would sit unread in some forgotten inbox, or worse, deleted without a second thought. But when the phone rang and his father's name appeared on the screen, the air around him stilled. He didn't answer on the first ring. He stared at the screen for a few seconds, as if trying to determine whether the call was real or another early morning hallucination brought on by exhaustion and regret. It rang again. He answered. "Dad?" There was a pause, brief but thick. "Hey," John said, voice low, calm. Michael swallowed. "I wasn't sure you'd call." "I wasn't sure I would either." The line stayed silent for a moment. Then John spoke again. "I watched the video." Michael nodded to himself. "Okay. I didn't delete it." "Thanks." More silence. John's voice returned. "I didn't go away to make you feel guilty, Michael. I didn't leave to make a point. I left because I couldn't breathe in that house anymore. It started to feel like I was a guest in my own life." Michael leaned against the kitchen counter, his hand wrapped tightly around the phone. "I didn't know," he said softly. "I didn't see any of it." "No," John replied. "You didn't. But it's not just about seeing. It's about choosing not to look." Michael flinched. He didn't argue. "I gave you everything I had," John continued. "Not just money or help. Time. Love. Sacrifice. But after a while, it stopped mattering. I became background noise. Useful when needed, silent otherwise." "I never meant to do that," Michael said. "I swear I didn't." "I know," John said. "But meaning well doesn't undo what's already done." Michael sat at the kitchen table now, hunched forward, eyes closed. "I've been trying to think back to when it started. When I stopped showing up the way I should've." "It doesn't matter when," John said. "It matters that you see it now." Michael nodded again, though his father couldn't see it. John's voice shifted slightly. "I'm not angry. That's the hardest part to explain. I'm not storming off. I'm just done waiting for something to change." "Then let me change," Michael said quickly. "Let me try. I'm not stopping you. But I'm not coming home to be convinced." Michael rubbed his forehead. "Where are you?" "Utah. Near the Salt Flats. I'll be heading north soon." Michael wanted to ask if he was okay, if he was safe, if he needed anything, but all those questions felt shallow now. Of course John was okay. He was doing exactly what he needed to do. "You left the house spotless," Michael said, forcing a slight smile. "Even the mailbox was empty." John chuckled softly. "Habits die hard." They both paused, and in that pause, something softer emerged. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But the beginning of a bridge. "You know," John said slowly, "when you were a kid, you used to wait for me at the window when I came home. No matter the weather. Rain, snow, you were there. I used to think, if I ever gave you enough love, you'd always be that kid. The one who waited." Michael's throat tightened. "I guess I didn't realize," John continued, "that sometimes parents wait too." "I'm sorry, Dad," Michael said, his voice cracking. "I'm really sorry." "I know." There was a long silence after that. Neither of them filled it. Eventually, John broke it. "I don't know when I'll come back. I'm not making plans. But I'll answer when you call. For now." Michael exhaled. "That's enough. For now." They stayed on the line a few minutes longer, neither wanting to be the one to hang up. When the call finally ended, Michael sat still at the kitchen table for a long while. Emily walked in, still in her robe, hair messy from sleep. She looked at him curiously. Was that him? He nodded. She approached and wrapped her arms around his shoulders, kissing the top of his head. How did it go? He didn't speak for a few seconds. Then finally, he's still gone. But now I know where. Outside, the sun had begun to spill into the room. Miles away, John pulled over on the side of a quiet road, turned off the engine, and stepped out. The desert air was dry and still. He looked out at the horizon, his phone in his hand. He hadn't told Michael everything. He hadn't told him about the photo albums he had left behind, or the letter he had written months earlier and tucked away for a time he hoped would never come. But for now, it was enough. A call had been made. A bridge had begun. And even if they were still far apart, the silence had been broken. Michael didn't sleep well after the call with his father. He kept replaying every word, trying to absorb what was said and what was left unsaid. The calmness in John's voice haunted him more than anger ever could have. It wasn't fury that had sent his father away, it was exhaustion. A quiet, invisible erosion of something that should have been unshakable. The next morning, Michael woke early and scrolled through his phone. He searched again for signs of where John might go next. He looked at maps, tried to recall places his father had once talked about, campgrounds, state parks, scenic byways. None of it gave him any real clues. He thought about calling again, just to hear his voice. But something held him back. So instead, he recorded a second video. This one wasn't planned. He simply turned on the camera and let it happen. "Dad," he said, "I know you said not to try to convince you. I'm not going to do that. I just want to keep talking. Even if you don't reply." He paused, looking out the window at the light beginning to fill the sky. "I don't think I ever really saw you as a whole person. That sounds awful, but it's true. You were always just Dad. A constant. A fixture. I never asked how you were doing. I never wondered what you wanted. Not really." He ended the message there. Short. Raw. Honest. He sent it and waited. No reply. The next day, he called. The phone rang, then went to voicemail. "Hey. Just checking in. I hope the weather's good wherever you are. I've been thinking about that road trip we always said we'd do. Yellowstone, Glacier, all of that. Remember?" He hung up. He called again later that night. Left another voicemail. Then the next day, another. He tried a video again. This one from his office, late at night. "I know I keep talking about the past, but that's not what this is about. I'm not trying to rewind time. I'm just trying to understand what I missed while I was racing ahead." John didn't respond to any of them. Not with a message. Not with a call. Not even a read receipt. But Michael kept going. Call number 8 came from the driveway, sitting in his car, too tired to go inside. Call number 11 came from the parking lot of Olivia's school, just after a parent-teacher meeting. Call number 15 came at 2 o'clock in the morning, after a nightmare that left him drenched in sweat and barely able to breathe. By call 17, his voice had changed. Less polished. More fractured. "I don't know if you're listening anymore. But I'm not going to stop." At call 19, Emily found him sitting at the dining room table, staring at the phone like it might bite him. She sat beside him quietly. "Is this helping?" "I don't know," he said. "But it's what I have left." Call 20 came after he visited the lake cabin alone. The place had been closed up since early spring, dust thick on the porch furniture, the water low in the summer heat. He walked through it slowly, opening windows, breathing in the smell of pine and age. He sat on the dock where they used to fish and made the call from there. "Remember the time we came up here and it snowed in April?" he said into the phone. "You cooked chili on the little propane stove and pretended it was all part of the plan. I believed you. I always did. He wiped his face and ended the call. Call 21 was simple. I miss you. Call 22, desperate. If you need me to say I was wrong, I'll say it. If you need me to stop asking for forgiveness and just start acting like I've changed, I'll do that too. Call 23 came 3 days later. He didn't know it would be the last one. He was standing in the garage, going through an old box of his father's belongings that he had never unpacked after John retired and downsized. In it, he found a small notebook with faded edges, filled with handwritten notes, budgeting details, grocery lists, to-do items. But in the back were pages labeled Michael, years 1 to 10. He flipped through them, reading line by line. First tooth, right side, August 3rd. Asked me if I'd always be here, I said yes. I hope that's true. Scared of the dark. Bought him a night light shaped like a moon. Pretended I wasn't tired when he asked me to tell a story. Michael sat on the garage floor, notebook open on his knees, and called again. Dad, he whispered. I found your notebook. I didn't know you wrote those things down. I didn't know you kept track like that. All that time, I thought you were just there. But you were paying attention. More than I ever did. He didn't say goodbye. He just let the line go quiet. Then he hung up. The next morning, a text arrived. From John. It was only 4 words. I heard all 23. Michael stared at the screen. Then he cried. For the first time since he was a child, he let it all out. Not in shame. Not in guilt. But in recognition. The silence had cracked. And something was finally reaching through. John didn't respond to Michael's last message right away. He had written those 4 words, I heard all 23, after sitting in silence for an hour in a quiet campground just outside Jackson, Wyoming. The Tetons loomed behind him, jagged and indifferent, snow clinging to the upper ridges even in late summer. It was the kind of landscape that swallowed noise, that made even grief feel small. He had listened to every voicemail, watched every video. He hadn't intended to. But on the 23rd call, something inside him shifted. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but something like gravity, pulling him back toward what he had almost given up on. That night, he opened his private photo journal, an online space he had created months ago but never shared with anyone. Only one person had access to it, Michael. He uploaded the first picture, a cracked picnic table in Missouri, taken from the seat where he'd once watched Michael, age 7, eating peanut butter sandwiches and wiping his hands on his shirt. The caption read, You refuse to eat the crusts. I told you one day you'd miss these lunches. I didn't realize I would too. Then he uploaded another, a faded road sign from Kansas that read, Next services, 54 miles. Underneath it, he wrote, Sometimes silence is a service. Sometimes it's a drought. He added 6 more photos that night. All memories. All places from their past. He didn't say much in the captions, just enough for Michael to know that none of it had been forgotten. The next morning, Michael saw the notification on the account he had almost given up checking. When he opened it and saw the photos, he sat back in his office chair, overwhelmed. There was no fanfare, no long letter of reconciliation, just the silent offering of memory. And it hit harder than any apology could have. Michael began replying under each photo. 1 or 2 sentences. Sometimes a question. Sometimes a confession. Under the picnic table post, he wrote, I remember that shirt. You washed it 3 times and the peanut butter never came out. Under the Kansas sign, you always said I'd learn to love the empty spaces. I think I'm starting to. This became their rhythm. Not calls. Not texts. But memories, shared like breadcrumbs across distance. John posted another photo from Colorado. A lake they had camped near when Michael was 12. In the picture, a single folding chair sat at the water's edge, empty. The caption read, You caught your first fish here. Cried when we threw it back. You said, I worked so hard for that. You didn't understand mercy yet. Michael responded that evening. Maybe I still don't. John read it and sat with that reply for a long time. Later that week, he visited a town he hadn't seen in 20 years, Eureka Springs, Arkansas. It had been their one impromptu trip, back when Michael was 16, and they decided on a whim to take a weekend off from everything. They hadn't planned it, hadn't booked ahead. They'd driven until the road ran out and found a small motel with lime green shutters and a cracked neon sign that buzzed through the night. John found the motel still standing, though it had changed names and been renovated. The shutters were now blue. The sign was gone. He didn't stay the night. But he took a photo. From the parking lot, facing the room they had stayed in. The caption read, "You made me watch a horror movie that night. Then made me sleep closest to the door. I didn't mind. I never did." Michael saw it the next day and didn't write back immediately. But when he did, his response was longer. "I used to think you didn't get scared. Like you were built differently. That night, I remember thinking you were invincible. I think that's when I stopped asking how you felt. I assumed you never needed protecting." John read that message while sitting in a laundromat in Nebraska, waiting for his clothes to dry. Around him, machines hummed and turned, but none of the noise reached him. For the first time in weeks, he felt something soften in his chest. Not release, but a beginning. He clicked reply. "I did get scared. I just didn't want you to carry it." Meanwhile, Michael found himself returning to old places too. The high school football field. The bridge over the creek where he and John used to skip stones. The storage unit where some of John's things had been kept after the downsizing. Each place brought a piece of something back. Not always comfort, but clarity. One afternoon, he sat in the garage, holding one of John's old flannel jackets that still smelled faintly of motor oil and cedar. He found himself talking out loud, as if his father were standing there. "I remember thinking you were too quiet sometimes," he said. "But maybe that silence was the loudest way you could love me. You showed up. Every time. And I never really asked why. I just let you." He paused. "I'm sorry for that." The next day, John posted a photo of a diner stool with worn red leather. The caption was brief. "You were 5. You spilled your milkshake. Thought I'd be mad. I told you, that's what napkins are for. I didn't mean the table." Michael's reply. "You meant life." By then, they were speaking almost daily through the photos and captions. But the words had become less about the past and more about where they stood now. Neither was ready to name what they were rebuilding. But the act itself, the quiet, shared reflection, was enough to carry them further than either had imagined possible. One night, John stood at the edge of a canyon overlook, camera in hand, and took a photo of the stars above. He captioned it. "You once asked me if I thought there was more out there. I told you I hoped so. I still do." Michael saw the post and sat with it a long while before typing his reply. "There is. I think it starts here." The decision to find his father wasn't sudden. It was slow, like erosion, small moments eating away at Michael's resistance until all that remained was the certainty that words alone wouldn't be enough. He needed to see John. Not just for closure, but for clarity. For accountability. For presence. After nearly 2 months of silence broken only by digital breadcrumbs and memory-choked captions, Michael booked a flight to Colorado. It wasn't a guess. It was a pinpoint. In one of John's latest photo posts, a reflection in a window had revealed a partial sign, Timberline Campground. A quick search narrowed it to a place just outside Gunnison, nestled between alpine forests and a wide, cold lake. Michael arrived on a crisp afternoon in early fall, the leaves turning gold and red along the mountain road. The elevation made his chest feel tighter than usual, but the weight in his stomach had nothing to do with altitude. As he drove toward the campground in a rented SUV, he rehearsed what he wanted to say. He would be calm. He would be honest. And above all, he would listen. He parked just outside the gravel loop where the RVs lined the woods like tired soldiers. A few families were sitting near campfires. A dog barked from a few sites down. And then he saw it. The motorhome. His father's. The same modest white rig with the silver trim and faded manufacturer decal. He stepped out of the vehicle, heart pounding, hands colder than they should have been. He didn't knock right away. He stood near the fire pit, looking at the closed door. A small folding chair sat beside it, a paperback novel open and face down on the armrest. There was a mug next to it, still half full. Michael cleared his throat, then knocked once, firm, but not loud. A few seconds passed. Then the door opened. John appeared, eyes shadowed by the brim of his cap, flannel sleeves rolled up to his elbows, a pause hanging between them like a breath neither was sure how to release. Michael spoke first. "Hey." John nodded. "Didn't expect you. I didn't want to keep talking through screens." John stepped aside. "Come in." The inside of the motorhome was clean but lived in. A worn blanket over the seat. A journal open on the small table. A map with creased edges pinned to the wall. The space smelled like coffee and something earthy, cedar or pine. Michael sat where John gestured, across from him at the small booth. No one spoke at first. Then Michael said, "I saw the post from this morning. The diner in Grand Junction." John nodded slowly. "They still burn the toast." Michael smiled faintly, then let it fade. "I needed to see you. I needed to say some of it face to face." John didn't look surprised. "You've already said a lot." "Not enough." John leaned back slightly. "Okay." Michael clasped his hands on the table. "When you left, I was hurt. Confused. Then angry. And then, ashamed. And I realize now I spent years justifying things that should never have been brushed off. I told myself I was busy. I told myself you were fine. That you didn't need much. That you'd always be there." He paused, swallowing the tightness in his throat. "I was wrong." John didn't interrupt. Michael continued, "I think the hardest part is realizing how easy it was to let you fade. Not out of cruelty, but because I didn't want to face what it meant to keep you fully present. To make space for your story when I was too consumed with writing my own." Still, John was quiet. But his eyes were locked on his son now, no longer guarded. "I can't fix what I missed," Michael said. "And I'm not here to ask you to pretend it didn't matter. But I want to be better from this point forward. If you'll let me." There was a long pause. Then John spoke, slowly. "You know what hurt the most?" Michael shook his head. "It wasn't the car," John said. "Wasn't the gift. Wasn't the will. It was seeing how easily I was replaced. Not just by your father-in-law. But by silence. You replaced me with convenience. With comfort. With assumptions." Michael bowed his head. "I know. And I let it happen," John added. "That's the part one own. I let myself believe it was enough to just be nearby. To show up, to pay, to help, to wait. But eventually, I wasn't waiting for anything anymore. Just surviving." The two men sat in silence, the weight of decades slowly rising to the surface. Then John leaned forward, his voice lower. "But here's the thing," he said. "Even now, after everything, I still love you. That never left. But love doesn't excuse forgetting someone's humanity. And I won't let mine be forgotten again." Michael nodded. "I don't want that either." "I'm not coming back tomorrow," John said. "I don't know when I will. This trip isn't over for me. I'm still figuring out who I am outside of what I gave away." "I understand. But you're welcome to walk with me for a while," John added. "Not as a son trying to fix the past. Just as a man trying to learn." Michael's eyes welled, but he didn't let the tears fall. "I'd like that," he said. They didn't hug. Not yet. But something shifted. John stood, opened the cabinet, pulled out a second mug, and poured coffee for both of them. They sat quietly, sipping in unison, while the wind outside rustled the trees and the sun cast long shadows through the windows. No grand reconciliation. No dramatic forgiveness. Just two men sitting together. Not as they were. But maybe, finally, as they were becoming. Michael stayed in Colorado longer than he expected. Originally, he had booked a flight back for Monday, thinking a short weekend would be enough for the confrontation, enough to clear the air, say what needed to be said. But when Sunday came and his phone lit up with the boarding reminder, he ignored it. Something unspoken had changed after their conversation in the motorhome. The emotional distance hadn't vanished, but it had shrunk just enough to feel like something worth holding on to. John didn't ask why he stayed. Michael didn't offer an explanation. Instead, they began falling into a rhythm, one that was less father and son and more like two strangers relearning each other's language. On Monday, they hiked a short trail near the campground. The path wasn't difficult, but the air was thin, and they walked in silence most of the way. Near the summit, John stopped and pointed to a stretch of untouched valley below. "Used to think I'd retire somewhere like that," he said. "Buy a little land, plant a garden, maybe keep chickens." Michael smiled faintly. "What stopped you?" John shrugged. "Life. Bills. Other people's futures." Michael didn't speak right away. Then, softly, "I think I always assumed you were content. You never asked for more." "That doesn't mean I didn't want more," John replied. That night, they built a fire together. No words. Just the crackle of wood and the kind of quiet that felt earned, not awkward. Michael watched his father move, hands practiced, deliberate. Everything he did was with care, with purpose. There was a reverence in how John treated even the small things, like folding his coat or adjusting the logs. "I used to make fun of how long it took you to pack for trips," Michael said with a grin. "I remember," John replied, not looking up. "And yet, I was always the one who had the extra batteries when your flashlight died." Michael chuckled. "Yeah, you were." The next morning, over coffee brewed on the camp stove, John opened a weathered notebook and slid it across the table. "These are for you," he said. Michael opened it cautiously. Inside were pages filled with small, neat handwriting, dates, notes, thoughts. Not a journal exactly, but a log of sorts. "These are the places I've stopped," John explained. "What I noticed. What I remembered." Michael read a few entries in silence. July 17th, wind blew hard off the plains today. Smelled like wheat and dust. Reminded me of the drive to college orientation. Michael had fallen asleep in the passenger seat. I didn't want to wake him when we got there. August 3rd, saw a boy playing catch with his dad outside a gas station. Thought about all the times I made excuses to leave work early for practice. I used to think I'd get fired. I never did. September 5th, dreamed about his 10th birthday. Forgot the cake in the truck. He didn't care. Said the balloons were his favorite part. Michael closed the notebook, overwhelmed. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything." "No, I do," Michael said. "I used to think you were quiet because you had nothing to say. Now I realize it was because you had too much." John didn't respond immediately. Instead, he poured another cup of coffee and watched the steam rise between them. Then he said, "I kept those memories because I wasn't sure anyone else would. And maybe because I was afraid I'd forget them first." Michael stared down at his hands. "I've been talking to Mom," he said after a long pause. John looked up sharply. "At the cemetery," Michael clarified. "Not, you know. Just talking. Saying things I should have said years ago." John's eyes softened. "She would have liked that," he said quietly. Michael nodded. "I told her I'm trying. That I'm learning to stop assuming love is enough when you don't show it. John didn't speak for a long while. Then, in a voice that barely carried over the morning wind, he said, "She was the first person who ever told me I was worth more than what I could do for others." Michael swallowed hard. "She told me that too. I just forgot to believe it." There was a long silence, but it wasn't empty. It was full. Heavy with shared grief, unspoken affection, and something that resembled healing. That afternoon, they drove together into town. Not to do anything important, just groceries, fuel, a new camp chair. But it felt significant. Like rehearsing a version of life they hadn't known how to live before. At the hardware store, Michael pointed out a radio in the window. "You used to have one just like that." John smiled. "Still do. Doesn't work." Michael paused. "I'll fix it." John looked at him. "You know how?" "No," Michael said, cracking a smile. "But I'll figure it out." That night, over grilled sausages and canned beans, they talked about trivial things, sports, weather, bad movies. It was the kind of conversation they hadn't had in years. Casual. Easy. No tension beneath the surface. As they cleaned up, John said, "You staying another day?" Michael looked at the fading light. "As many as you'll let me." John nodded. "All right then." They sat under the stars that night, sharing a flask of whiskey that had been tucked away in John's cabinet. "You used to say life isn't made of big moments," Michael said. "It's made of small ones you remember without trying." John nodded. "Still believe that?" Michael raised the flask. "Then this is one of those." John took it, sipped, then replied, "I hope so." There were no big declarations. No final resolution. But in the soft crackle of the fire, in the warmth of quiet companionship, something old was being rebuilt, not as it had been, but as it might become. And for the first time in years, both men allowed themselves to hope. By the end of the week, something unspoken between John and Michael had changed. It wasn't just the comfort of shared meals or the rhythm of conversation, it was the way they had begun to exist near each other without effort. The silences no longer held weight. They were natural, restful. Like breathing between sentences. Michael stayed in Colorado for another 5 days. They visited old towns and quiet lakes. Walked short trails. Cooked simple meals. They shared stories, some familiar, some entirely new. Michael learned about John's first job as a teenager fixing fences for neighbors, about the time he almost joined the Navy instead of the Army, about the first time he saw Michael's mother and how he'd known, instantly, he was looking at his future. John listened too, really listened. He asked about Michael's work, about the girls, about things he'd never asked before, not out of indifference, but because the space to ask had never existed. One morning, sitting on a bench overlooking a valley painted gold by fall, Michael said, "I think I've spent so much of my life trying to prove something, to you, to myself, to everyone. And all it did was make me miss what was already there." John didn't offer advice. He just said, "Then stop missing it." And Michael nodded. When he finally did leave, it wasn't with sadness, but with something else, something steadier. He hugged John tightly, the way a man does when he knows it isn't goodbye, just a pause. John clapped him on the back, firm and warm. "Don't be a stranger," John said. Michael smiled. Not anymore. The flight home felt different. Lighter. And for once, Michael wasn't consumed by what waited on the other end, deadlines, noise, the persistent hum of things left undone. This time, he carried something with him. Something invisible, but solid. Back home, Emily met him at the airport. The girls had made a banner that said, "Welcome back, Daddy," in bright, uneven letters. Claire had drawn a stick figure of their family, this time including a taller man with a beard. "Grandpa," she announced. At dinner that night, Michael found himself more present than usual. He didn't check his phone during the meal. He listened as the girls described their art projects and their arguments over toy dinosaurs. Emily gave him a knowing smile. Later that week, he asked Emily for help organizing something small. Nothing extravagant. Just a dinner. A few people. Quiet. It took place on a Saturday evening. Michael made the calls himself. His siblings came, along with their partners. A few old friends of John's. Even Ralph, the fishing buddy, drove in from out of town. The house was warm, filled with food and low conversation. It felt like something that had been missing for too long. John arrived just after 6. He didn't knock. Michael had told him not to. Just come in like you used to, he'd said on the phone. Like you always should've. When John stepped inside, everyone greeted him with hugs, handshakes, and quiet laughter. He looked slightly out of place, but not unwelcome. He carried a small tin of homemade peanut brittle and a bottle of decent whiskey. Michael stood by the fireplace, watching his father move through the room. He had seen this man all his life, but something about this moment struck him differently. John wasn't a background figure anymore. He wasn't waiting on the sidelines. He was here. Present. Whole. When dinner was served, everyone settled around the table, a little cramped, a little chaotic, but exactly right. The noise of multiple conversations filled the room, memories, jokes, questions. For the first time, John wasn't quiet. He told stories. He laughed. He even teased Michael in front of everyone, which earned a round of laughter and a mock scowl from his son. Then, just before dessert, Michael stood. He hadn't planned a speech. But he found himself speaking anyway. I wasn't going to say anything formal, he began, but then I realized that some things need to be said out loud, especially when you've spent too long not saying them. The table grew quiet. I used to think my dad was just there. Always. Like the ground under your feet. You don't notice it until something cracks. He glanced at John. And a lot cracked. Most of it, I didn't even see until it was too late. But the thing about my dad, he didn't disappear because he was angry. He left because he knew he couldn't keep carrying love on his own. And I don't blame him. Michael swallowed, looked down for a moment, then back up. What I do know is this, he's not invisible anymore. Not to me. Not to any of us. And he never should have been. John didn't respond right away. But he raised his glass. Not high. Just enough. To visibility, he said quietly. Everyone raised theirs. And for a moment, nothing else mattered. After dinner, Michael handed his father a simple gift, no wrapping, just a folded piece of paper in an envelope. John opened it. Inside was a letter. Short. Honest. Dad. This isn't repayment. There's no such thing. It's just a beginning. I've updated the deed to the cabin. Your name is back on it. I want it to be shared. Yours, mine, and one day, the girls. Not because of inheritance. But because of memory. John folded the letter slowly. Then looked at Michael. And nodded. He said nothing. But everything was said. That night, after everyone had gone home and the house had grown quiet, Michael stepped outside. The sky was clear. Cool air brushed against his face. From his pocket, he pulled out a photo, one John had given him earlier in the evening. It was old. A black and white snapshot of a younger John holding baby Michael in his arms, both squinting against the sun. On the back, John had written, "The beginning of everything that ever mattered." Michael stood in the dark, holding that photo, feeling both the weight and the lightness of it all. And for the first time in a long time, he felt whole. Autumn had settled deeply into the valley. Leaves rustled in copper and crimson across driveways and sidewalks, and the air had taken on that familiar, faint chill, the kind that signaled not just a change of season, but something quieter, deeper. Michael found himself walking more, not to go anywhere in particular, but to process the strange sensation of stillness that had replaced years of emotional noise. It had been nearly a month since the dinner. since the moment he had stood at the head of the table and finally said out loud what had been buried for so long. John had returned to the road shortly after, as he said he would. Not in retreat, but in continuation. His journey wasn't finished. And Michael understood that now. They spoke regularly, though not every day. Sometimes it was just a text. A new photo. A line from a book. Sometimes it was a memory. Once, Michael received a simple message. Montana this morning. Snow on the peaks. You'd like it. Reminds me of that birthday hike when you slipped in the creek and told me never to tell anyone. I didn't. Until now. Michael laughed out loud when he read it, alone in his office, and replied, "Traitor." The messages weren't sentimental. They were something better, normal. Living. Real. One Friday, Michael received a certified envelope at his office. Inside was a letter with a familiar signature and a copy of an updated legal document. It was John's will. The new one. Michael sat down, alone in the quiet of his office, and unfolded the letter first. It was handwritten. Just a single page. Michael. This isn't dramatic. It's not a reversal, and it's not an apology for what I changed before. That version of the will reflected exactly how I felt at the time, and that truth needed to stand. But things are different now. Not because we fixed everything, but because we faced it. And because you showed up when it would have been easier not to. I didn't write this to offer you something material. That's never been the point. I'm including you again because you finally saw me. Not the role. Not the obligation. Me. The cabin is yours to share. The rest, well, you'll see. What matters more is this: if you're reading this after I'm gone, I want you to remember the last chapter wasn't written out of bitterness. It was written in peace. Live your life knowing there's no debt between us. Just a long road, finally walked together. Love. Dad. Michael read it twice. Then he opened the will itself. It was generous, but modest. Everything expected was there: his siblings, a few donations to causes John had always supported, the house to be sold with proceeds divided. And one clause that wasn't legal at all, but had been included anyway. A short paragraph that read: "The most important inheritance isn't listed in this document. It's in the time you offer the people who raised you. If you forget that, everything else loses meaning." Michael folded the document slowly, almost reverently. He didn't call his father that day. He didn't need to. There were no questions. Just an understanding between two men who had built something new on the ashes of distance. That weekend, he drove to the cabin. It had been cleaned up. His siblings had visited, left behind small improvements: a new coat of paint on the porch, fresh linens on the beds. Michael brought with him a duffel bag and his daughters. It was Claire's first time seeing the place. She stood at the edge of the dock, wide-eyed, watching the water ripple gently. "Is this Grandpa's?" she asked. Michael knelt beside her. "It was. And now, it's all of ours." She nodded solemnly, as if understanding something larger than her age could explain. Inside, he lit the old stone fireplace, poured 2 glasses of scotch, and sat across from the empty chair near the window. One glass for him. One left untouched. He wasn't talking to ghosts. He was honoring presence, the presence of everything they had reclaimed. The next morning, the girls played outside while Michael wrote in a small notebook. It wasn't a journal. It was a letter. Not to be sent, but to be kept. "Dad. You told me once the most important things aren't passed down. They're paid forward. I didn't get it then. But now, every time I hold Claire's hand or tell Olivia a story from your life, I see it. Not just the stories. But the effort. The choice to be present. You taught me that being a father isn't about big moments. It's about never leaving the room, even when no one sees you standing there. Thank you for not disappearing completely, even when I gave you every reason to. We're still here. Both of us. Walking. That night, before leaving the cabin, he took the folded letter and slid it behind a loose panel in the back of the bookshelf, where the others had left notes and photos, their own fragments of connection. Back at home, Michael began to change things. Not dramatically, but intentionally. He called his siblings more often. He started having dinner at the table every night with no phones. He asked questions. Real ones. And when his daughters asked for another bedtime story, he gave them too. Weeks later, John returned home. Not to stay forever. Just to visit. They sat on the porch one evening, watching the sky turn soft with twilight. "You kept the photo," John said, pointing to the frame on the side table, the one of him holding baby Michael in the sun. Michael nodded. "It's the beginning of everything that ever mattered." "That's what you wrote." John smiled faintly. "I was wrong," Michael added. "Oh? It wasn't the beginning. The beginning was you deciding to stay. Every day. Quietly. Without asking for thanks." John didn't respond with words. He reached over and clasped his son's shoulder, briefly, firmly, completely. Then he said, "There's still time left." Michael looked out at the fading horizon. "I know." And between them, the silence wasn't absence anymore. It was presence, finally understood.